The emergency sirens blared relentlessly as the starship Solstice spiraled uncontrollably toward the surface of Epsilon 3, a planet shrouded in mystery and untamed beauty. Commander Evelyn Harker's hands moved with practiced precision over the controls, but nothing responded. Sparks erupted from the console as systems failed one after another. Beside her, Lornath, her alien co-pilot with scaled, iridescent skin, barked updates in his guttural language, his frustration mirroring her own. Outside the viewport, the planet's dense forests stretched endlessly, glowing faintly under the planet's twin moons. The proximity alarm screamed as the ship plunged toward a rocky cliff. Evelyn made a desperate effort to redirect the descent. The Solstice clipped the edge of the cliff, skidded through the dense forest canopy, and finally crashed to a halt amidst an explosion of dirt and debris. When Evelyn regained consciousness, the world around her was silent except for the faint crackling of small fires. The cockpit was a ruin, its shattered glass revealing an alien wilderness bathed in an eerie bioluminescent glow. Pain lanced through her body as she unbuckled herself from the pilot's seat, her mind already racing to assess the situation. Lornath stirred beside her, his scales marred by burns but alive. A quick scan of the controls confirmed the worst. The ship was beyond repair, and the emergency beacon had been destroyed. They were stranded. Evelyn stumbled into the main corridor, where chaos reigned. She found the remaining crew in various states of shock and injury. Dr. Claire Weston, the human biologist, was already tending to injuries despite the gash on her own forehead. Vrex, the alien engineer with 4 muscular arms, was attempting to salvage parts of the ship. Janik, the jittery communications officer, was muttering about the silence of the forest, his antennae twitching nervously. Evelyn's voice cut through the tension as she ordered everyone to regroup. Despite the grim situation, she knew that panic would only make things worse. They needed a plan. As the crew scavenged the wreckage for supplies, the oppressive silence of the forest became unnerving. The air was thick with a strange energy that made Evelyn's skin prickle. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being washed. The ground beneath their feet felt oddly alive, pulsing faintly with each step. Before she could voice her concerns, a low rumble echoed through the trees, followed by a deafening screech. Out of the shadows emerged towering creatures with insectoid bodies and metallic appendages, their glowing blue eyes fixed on the intruders. The crew scattered as the creatures attacked with razor-sharp limbs. Evelyn fired her plasma sidearm, but the shots deflected harmlessly off the creatures' exoskeletons. Lornath roared as he unleashed a barrage of energy blasts, managing to slow one of the creatures but not stop it. Evelyn shouted for everyone to retreat to the ship, but the creatures were relentless, encircling them with terrifying efficiency. Just when it seemed their fate was sealed, the ground shook violently, and a new sound pierced the chaos, a resonant roar that sent the creatures scuttling back into the shadows. Through the trees emerged a towering figure clad in shimmering crystalline armor. It radiated a soft, otherworldly light that seemed to calm the forest itself. The figure surveyed the scene with an air of quiet authority before addressing the crew in a deep, resonant voice. "You do not belong here. Come with me if you wish to survive." Evelyn hesitated, her instincts warning against trusting the unknown, but the alternative was certain death. With a nod, she signaled the crew to follow. The figure led them through the forest, its steps silent despite its massive presence. The path it took was marked by glowing flora that seemed to react to its proximity, bending toward the light it emitted. After what felt like an eternity, they'd reached a hidden cavern illuminated by crystals that pulsed with a soothing hum. The air here was lighter, the oppressive energy of the forest held at bay. The figure turned to face them, its crystalline face unreadable but its voice steady. "I am Kleos, the last of the Wardens. This is a sacred world, one that does not forgive trespassers." Evelyn stepped forward, her tone firm but respectful. "We didn't mean to trespass. Our ship crashed. We're stranded." Kleos regarded her in silence for a moment before speaking. "This world is alive. It sees you as a threat. If you wish to survive, you must prove your worth. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Cleos's words sinking in. This was no ordinary survival mission. The planet itself was their judge, and failure was not an option. Evelyn squared her shoulders, determination hardening her gaze. "Tell us what we need to do." The crew followed Cleos into the heart of the cavern, their unease growing with every step. The crystalline walls glowed faintly, casting shimmering reflections across the damp surface. The hum of the crystals was soothing, but it did little to quell the anxiety gnawing at Evelyn. Her crew was battered. The ship was destroyed. And now they were at the mercy of an alien entity whose motives were unclear. Cleos walked with deliberate grace, his towering form a stark contrast to the fragile humans trailing behind him. He stopped suddenly, his voice reverberating through the cavern. "The forest has deemed you unworthy. To survive, you must change its judgment." Evelyn stepped forward, meeting his gaze. "What does that mean? What do we have to do?" Cleos's crystalline face seemed to shimmer with a faint light as he spoke. "This world is alive, its essence tied to every living thing within it. It sees you as a disruption, an imbalance. To prove your worth, you must restore balance. There is a blight spreading across the forest, consuming its vitality. If you eliminate it, the forest may grant you mercy." Evelyn frowned, trying to process his words. "A blight? What kind of blight?" "It is not of this world, much like you," Cleos replied. "It came from the void, corrupting everything it touches. You must destroy its core, deep within the forest." Dr. Claire Weston, standing nearby, adjusted the settings on her medical scanner. "If this blight is biological or parasitic, we might need more than just weapons to deal with it." Cleos turned to Claire, his voice calm but firm. "The forest will provide what you need if you prove yourselves worthy. The path ahead is dangerous, but it is the only way." The cavern fell silent as the crew absorbed the weight of the task before them. Evelyn glanced at her team. Claire, her face pale but resolute. Lornath, his scaled arms crossed as he stared at Cleos with suspicion. Janik, fidgeting nervously, and Vrex, who simply nodded, his massive frame ready for action. They were a ragtag group, injured and out of their depth, but Evelyn knew they didn't have a choice. "We'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. "Tell us where to start." Cleos extended one crystalline arm, and the ground beneath them shimmered. A map of the forest appeared, glowing faintly with lines of energy. "The core of the blight lies here," he said, pointing to a darkened area on the map. "Follow the glowing path. The forest will guide you, but it will also test you. Be prepared." As Cleos finished speaking, the map faded, and the crystal's light dimmed slightly. The crew gathered their limited supplies, piecing together what little they had salvaged from the wreckage. Weapons were scarce, and their communication devices were useless in the dense energy field of the planet. Despite these challenges, Evelyn felt a flicker of determination. She had faced impossible odds before, and she wasn't about to let her crew down now. The journey through the forest was unlike anything they had experienced. The glowing flora pulsed with an almost sentient rhythm, reacting to their presence. Strange creatures darted through the underbrush, their forms a blend of organic and mechanical. The air was thick with a sweet, intoxicating scent that made it hard to focus. Every now and then, Cleos's words echoed in Evelyn's mind. "The forest will test you." The first test came sooner than expected. As they approached a narrow ravine, the ground beneath them trembled. From the shadows emerged creatures that resembled the ones that had attacked them earlier, but these were larger and more menacing. Their exoskeletons glistened with a sickly green hue, and their eyes burned with an unnatural light. "Blight infected," Claire whispered, her voice tinged with both awe and fear. "They're corrupted by whatever this thing is." The creatures lunged, and the crew scattered. Lornath charged forward, his plasma weapon blazing, while Vrex used his massive strength to shield the others. Evelyn fired precise shots, aiming for the creature's glowing cores, but they were relentless. Janek, panicked and stumbling, nearly fell into the ravine before Claire grabbed him, pulling him back to safety. As the battle raged, the forest seemed to come alive. The glowing plants around them brightened, their light intensifying until it formed a barrier of energy. The creatures recoiled, their screeches filling the air as they retreated into the shadows. The crew stood in stunned silence, the barrier fading as quickly as it had appeared. "The forest helped us," Claire said, her voice trembling. "It wants us to succeed." Evelyn nodded, her breathing heavy. "Let's hope it keeps wanting that." With the immediate danger past, the crew pressed on, their steps more cautious but their resolve stronger. The path ahead was uncertain, but Evelyn knew they had no choice but to trust the forest and each other. The fate of their survival depended on it. As the crew continued their journey through the forest, an unsettling silence enveloped them. The bioluminescent plants that had once pulsed softly now seemed dimmer, their glow flickering like a fading heartbeat. Evelyn took point, her senses sharpened despite the exhaustion creeping into her body. The map Cleos had shown them was seared into her memory, but the path seemed to shift subtly, as if the forest itself was altering their route. Every step felt heavier, the air thick with an unidentifiable tension. Janek stumbled behind, muttering under his breath about shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Lornath, ever vigilant, kept his plasma weapon at the ready, his eyes scanning for threats. Claire and Vrex walked in the middle, sharing the weight of their limited supplies. Evelyn didn't want to admit it, but the strain was beginning to take its toll on all of them. As they approached a dense thicket, the ground beneath them trembled slightly. A faint sound, almost like a heartbeat, echoed through the air. Evelyn raised a hand to signal the others to stop. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. Lornath nodded, his scaled head tilting toward the sound. "It's coming from ahead." Pushing through the thick underbrush, they emerged into a clearing dominated by a massive, pulsating structure. It rose from the ground like a grotesque wound, its surface covered in a black, viscous substance that oozed and bubbled with unnatural energy. The heartbeat sound was louder now, rhythmic and oppressive, as if the forest itself was alive and in pain. "That's it," Claire said, her voice a mix of awe and horror. "That's the core of the blight." Evelyn stepped forward cautiously, her weapon trained on the structure. The air around it felt wrong, heavy with a suffocating energy that made it hard to breathe. The crew spread out, forming a loose circle around the core. Vrex approached with a scanner, his 4 arms moving with practiced efficiency as he tried to analyze the structure. "It's alive," he said, his deep voice tinged with unease. "Organic and synthetic elements fused together. This is no natural phenomenon." Before Evelyn could respond, the ground erupted around them. The corrupted creatures they had encountered earlier poured into the clearing, their glowing green eyes fixated on the crew. But these were different. Faster, stronger, and far more aggressive. They moved with a terrifying coordination, as if controlled by the blight itself. Evelyn shouted orders, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold the line. Protect the scanner." She fired at the creatures, aiming for the weak points they had discovered earlier. Lornath and Vrex fought with brutal efficiency, their combined strength barely keeping the creatures at bay. Claire focused on supporting Janek, who was frantically trying to keep their gear from being destroyed. The battle raged, and the crew was pushed to their limits. Just when it seemed they might be overwhelmed, the forest intervened again. The plants surrounding the clearing erupted in a brilliant light, their energy forming tendrils that lashed out at the corrupted creatures. The creatures screeched and writhed, their bodies disintegrating under the forest's wrath. The light didn't stop there. It extended toward the blight's core, wrapping around it like a constricting net. The ground shook violently as the core resisted, its pulsations growing erratic. Evelyn and her crew staggered, struggling to stay on their feet. Vrex shouted over the noise, his scanner flashing with urgent warnings. The core is destabilizing. It's going to blow. Evelyn acted instinctively. Fall back. Now. She grabbed Claire and Janik, pulling them toward the edge of the clearing. Lornath and Vrex covered their retreat, firing at the remaining creatures until the crew was safely out of range. They barely made it to a ridge overlooking the clearing when the core exploded. The shockwave knocked them to the ground, and a blinding light engulfed the area. When the light faded, the clearing was gone, replaced by a crater surrounded by charred, lifeless trees. The oppressive energy that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a strange stillness. Evelyn pushed herself to her feet, helping Claire up as well. The crew gathered around her, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. "Did we do it?" Janik asked, his voice trembling. Before Evelyn could answer, Cleos appeared, stepping out of the shadows as if summoned by the destruction. His crystalline form shimmered faintly, and his deep voice carried a note of approval. "The blight is destroyed. The forest has deemed you worthy." Evelyn didn't feel victorious. Not yet. What about the forest? Will it recover? Cleos inclined his head. "The damage is great, but the balance will return. You have proven your resilience and earned the forest's mercy." The crew exchanged weary but relieved glances. They had survived the test, but Evelyn knew their journey wasn't over. Their ship was still beyond repair, and they were far from home. But for now, they had bought themselves time, a precious resource on this living, dangerous world. The forest remained eerily silent after the explosion of the Blight's core. The faint hum of life that had previously filled the air seemed to have faded, replaced by an oppressive stillness that weighed heavily on Evelyn and her crew. Standing on the edge of the crater, Evelyn's mind raced. They had destroyed the core, but the sight of the lifeless trees and the darkened clearing left her uneasy. Whatever balance they had restored felt fragile, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Cleos regarded the crew with his crystalline gaze, his form glinting faintly in the dim light. "The forest has accepted your actions, but its judgment is not final. The Blight's corruption was not born here. Its origin lies elsewhere, and its reach may extend beyond this world." Evelyn's exhaustion gave way to frustration. "We've done what you asked. We've proven ourselves. What more does the forest want?" Cleos's voice remained steady, unyielding. "Survival is not merely about proving your strength, but understanding the forces that challenge it. If you wish to leave this place, you must first unravel the source of the corruption." Claire stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fatigue. "Are you saying there's more to this blight? Something controlling it?" Cleos nodded. "The core you destroyed was merely a manifestation. The true source lies deeper, buried within the forest's ancient heart." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The idea of venturing even further into the forest, especially after their grueling battle, felt like a death sentence. Evelyn, however, couldn't ignore the unspoken challenge in Cleos's words. Their survival depended not just on escaping the forest, but on understanding it. She turned to her team, her voice firm despite her weariness. "We don't have a choice. If there's a chance to end this for good and get off this planet, we have to take it." Janik groaned, his antennae twitching nervously, deeper into the forest. "This place already tried to kill us. Twice." "It's not about what we want, Janik," Evelyn replied. "It's about what we need to do." Cleos extended his arm, and the ground beneath them shimmered once more, revealing another map. This one was far more intricate, its lines pulsing with faint energy that seemed to ripple outward. At the center of the map was a glowing symbol, surrounded by jagged lines and darkened areas that radiated danger. "This is the heart of the forest," Cleos said. "Its power is ancient, and its will is strong. The answers you seek lie here." The glowing map faded, and the ground returned to its natural state. Cleos's form flickered briefly, as though he were struggling to maintain his presence. "The path ahead will test you in ways you cannot imagine. The forest may guide you, or it may devour you. That is for it to decide. Without another word, Cleos disappeared, leaving the crew alone once more. The oppressive silence of the forest seemed to close in around them. Evelyn exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. She knew the crew needed her to be strong, even if she wasn't sure of the path ahead. "We move out at first light," she said. "Hit some rest while you can." The crew set up a makeshift camp near the crater's edge, using what little supplies they had left. The night was cold, and the faint glow of the bioluminescent plants offered little comfort. Evelyn sat apart from the others, her eyes scanning the darkened forest. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound magnified by the silence. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As she stared into the darkness, Claire approached, her face etched with concern. "You should try to get some sleep," she said softly. "We've got a long way to go tomorrow." Evelyn shook her head. "I can't. Not with everything that's happened. Not with what's ahead." Claire sat down beside her, the weight of their situation evident in her expression. "Do you think Cleos is telling the truth? That the blight came from somewhere else?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "But if there's even a chance we can stop it at the source, we have to try. If we don't, who knows how far this corruption could spread." Claire nodded, her gaze distant. "This planet, it's unlike anything I've ever studied. It's alive in ways I can't explain, and yet it feels so fragile, like it's teetering on the edge. That's why we have to keep going," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "Not just for us, but for whatever this place is. If it's alive, it deserves a chance to survive too." The two women sat in silence for a while, the faint glow of the crater casting long shadows around them. When the first rays of dawn broke through the dense canopy, the crew gathered their gear and prepared to move. The path ahead was uncertain, but Evelyn knew one thing for sure: they wouldn't stop until they found the answers they needed, no matter the cost. As the first light of dawn filtered through the thick canopy, Evelyn led her crew deeper into the forest. The air grew heavier with each step, the vibrant glow of the flora dimming to an unsettling twilight. The path marked on the map was barely visible, shifting like a mirage. The faint pulse of energy beneath their feet, once steady, now felt erratic, as if the forest itself was in pain. Evelyn moved cautiously, her weapon drawn, scanning for any sign of movement. Behind her, the crew followed in silence, the tension palpable. Lornath carried their salvaged equipment, his sharp eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Vrex, towering and steady, walked beside Claire, who clutched her scanner tightly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Janik brought up the rear, his antennae twitching nervously as he muttered to himself. The forest's energy shifted abruptly, and Evelyn froze. The crew halted behind her, their breaths held. Ahead, the path split into 3 directions, each marked by an ominous glow. The map Cleos had shown them had not prepared them for this. The pulsing of the ground grew stronger, almost like a warning. "Which way do we go?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn knelt and studied the glowing paths. Each seemed equally uninviting, but the energy emanating from the middle path felt more intense, almost as if it were pulling at her. "We stick together and take the center," she decided. "Stay alert." The group moved forward, the oppressive atmosphere growing heavier. The forest around them began to change, the bioluminescent plants twisting into grotesque forms. The air turned colder, and the once faint hum of life was replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint sound of whispers, too soft to understand. As they pressed on, the whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a living entity. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tense. "It's voices," Claire said, her expression haunted. "But they're not speaking any language I recognize." Lornath growled, his grip tightening on his weapon. "This place is trying to get into our heads. Focus. Ignore it." The whispers seemed to sense their defiance, growing louder and more distinct. The voices called out names, some familiar, some not. Evelyn heard her mother's voice, long gone, calling her name with a softness that cut through her resolve. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to push forward. Around her, the crew struggled, their steps faltering as the whispers targeted their deepest fears and memories. Janek stumbled and fell to his knees, his eyes wide with terror. "I can't. It's too much." Evelyn turned back, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Janek, look at me. It's not real. Fight it." Janek's gaze met hers, his breathing ragged. Slowly he nodded, finding his footing again. The crew regrouped, their determination renewed, but the forest was relentless. The whispers morphed into wails, the air growing thicker with each step. Evelyn's legs felt like lead, her vision blurring. Just as she thought she couldn't take another step, the ground beneath them shifted. A massive root erupted from the ground, splitting the group. Evelyn and Lornath were thrown to one side, while Claire, Janek, and Vrex landed on the other. Before Evelyn could shout, the root rose higher, forming a barrier that pulsed with energy, cutting her off from her crew. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Evelyn pounded on the barrier, shouting for the others, but it was unyielding. On the other side, Claire's muffled voice called out, but Evelyn couldn't make out the words. Lornath stood beside her, his plasma weapon glowing faintly as he examined the barrier. "We're being separated on purpose," he growled. "The forest wants to isolate us." Evelyn's mind raced. The forest had already proven its sentience, its ability to test them. This was no accident. "We keep moving," she said firmly. "If we're separated, it's trying to weaken us. We don't let it." The two pressed on, the path ahead narrowing into a tunnel of twisted roots. The faint glow of the bioluminescent plants was gone, replaced by an eerie red light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken, the oppressive energy waning on her more heavily than ever. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a cavern unlike any they had seen before. The walls were covered in what looked like living veins, pulsating with a dark energy that filled the air with a sense of dread. At the center of the cavern stood a massive, glowing entity, its form shifting and twisting as if it couldn't settle on a shape. It radiated the same energy as the Blight's core, but far more powerful. Evelyn and Lornath froze, their weapons drawn. The entity seemed to sense their presence, its shifting form turning toward them. It let out a low, resonant sound that vibrated through their very bones. Evelyn's grip on her weapon tightened. She had no idea how they were supposed to fight something like this, but one thing was clear. This was the true source of the corruption. "We're out of our depth," Lornath muttered, his voice steady but grim. "We've been out of our depth since we crashed," Evelyn replied, her eyes fixed on the entity. "But we're still here." The entity began to move, its form growing larger as it emitted a blinding light. Evelyn braced herself, knowing the hardest fight of their journey was just beginning. The entity's light flared, filling the cavern with an intensity that forced Evelyn and Lornath to shield their eyes. The air vibrated with a deep hum that resonated in their chests, making it difficult to breathe. As the light dimmed slightly, the entity's form became clearer, an amorphous mass of dark tendrils laced with glowing veins of red energy. It pulsed rhythmically, its presence oppressive and overwhelming. Evelyn's instincts screamed to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The tunnel behind them had sealed, leaving them trapped with this monstrosity. Lornath took a step forward, his plasma weapon aimed steadily at the creature. "If it bleeds, it can die," he growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before Evelyn could respond, the entity struck. A tendril lashed out with blinding speed, slamming into the ground where Lornath had stood a moment before. He rolled to the side, firing a volley of plasma bolts that seared into the creature's mass. The energy crackled and dissipated, leaving no visible damage. The entity let out a bone-rattling roar, its tendrils whipping toward them with ferocious speed. Evelyn dove for cover, firing her weapon at the tendrils as they snaked through the cavern. Her shots barely slowed them, the energy absorbed into the creature's glowing veins. "It's adapting," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening hum. "We need a new plan." Lornath fired another volley, narrowly dodging a tendril that slammed into the wall beside him. "Suggestions welcome, Commander." Evelyn's mind raced as she ducked behind a jagged outcrop. The entity's core glowed brighter with each attack, its energy feeding off their weapons. Fighting it head-on wasn't working. She glanced around the cavern, her eyes landing on the pulsating veins that covered the walls. The same red energy that coursed through the entity seemed to flow through them, connecting it to the environment. "It's drawing power from the cavern," Evelyn shouted. "We need to cut it off." Lornath glanced at the walls, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The veins. If we destroy them, it might weaken the creature." Evelyn nodded, already moving. She aimed her weapon at one of the glowing veins and fired. The plasma bolt struck true, causing the vein to writhe and darken. The entity let out a guttural roar, its tendrils flailing wildly as it recoiled. The glow of its core dimmed slightly. "It's working." Lornath bellowed, targeting another vein. His shot severed it, sending a shockwave through the cavern. The entity's movements grew more erratic, its form flickering, as if struggling to maintain its shape. Encouraged, Evelyn and Lornath focused their fire on the veins, methodically cutting off the creature's power source. Each destroyed vein weakened the entity further, its core flickering like a dying flame. But the fight was far from over. As its energy waned, the creature grew more desperate, lashing out with increased ferocity. One of its tendrils struck the outcrop where Evelyn had taken cover, shattering it into fragments and throwing her to the ground. Evelyn gasped as pain shot through her side. She struggled to her feet, her vision swimming. The entity loomed above her, its remaining energy concentrated in its core. A tendril lashed toward her, but before it could strike, Lornath leaped in its path, his plasma weapon blazing. The tendril slammed into him, sending him crashing into the cavern wall. He collapsed in a heap, unmoving. "Lornath!" Evelyn screamed, her voice breaking. She staggered to her feet, firing at the creature with everything she had. The tendrils recoiled, but it wasn't enough. The entity's core pulsed violently, its energy surging as it prepared for one final attack. Evelyn's heart pounded as she realized the only way to end this. She glanced at the remaining veins on the far side of the cavern, still feeding the creature's core. It would take one final push, but she had to sever them all at once. She grabbed a charge from Lornath's fallen gear, setting its timer as she sprinted across the cavern. The tendrils whipped toward her, their movements sluggish but still deadly. She dodged one, then another, her muscles screaming in protest. Reaching the cluster of veins, she slammed the charge into place and activated it. The entity's roar echoed through the cavern as its tendrils converged on her. Evelyn turned and ran, the timer ticking down in her head. She dove behind a large boulder just as the charge detonated. The explosion ripped through the cavern, obliterating the remaining veins in a blinding flash of light. When the dust settled, the cavern was silent. The entity's form had disintegrated, its energy gone. The oppressive weight that had filled the air was lifted, replaced by an almost serene stillness. Evelyn pushed herself to her feet, coughing as she surveyed the aftermath. The walls of the cavern no longer pulsed, their energy extinguished. She stumbled toward Lornath, who groaned as he stirred. Relief flooded her as she helped him sit up. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," he muttered, a weak grin on his face. Evelyn smiled despite her exhaustion. "Let's hope this was enough. I don't think we have another fight in us." The two of them made their way toward the tunnel, the faint light of the forest guiding them back. The entity was gone, but Evelyn knew their journey wasn't over yet. They still had to reunite with the rest of the crew and find a way off this planet. But for now, they had won a fragile victory, one that Evelyn hoped would be enough to secure their survival. Evelyn and Lornath emerged from the cavern into the forest, their bodies battered but their spirits resolute. The oppressive energy that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a calm that felt almost unnatural. The forest, though still quiet, seemed to pulse with a renewed vitality, its bioluminescent plants glowing brighter than before. It was as if the destruction of the entity had breathed life back into the world. The path ahead shimmered faintly, guiding them back to the crew. The forest, once hostile and unyielding, now seemed to part for them, its branches bending away as they moved. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the planet was watching them, not with hostility but with cautious curiosity. She glanced at Lornath, who limped beside her, his weapon slung over his shoulder. "Think the forest is done testing us?" "Doubt it," Lornath grunted, his tone wry. "But maybe it's decided we're not the enemy anymore." They followed the glowing path until it led them to a clearing where the rest of the crew waited. Claire was the first to spot them, her face lighting up with relief as she ran to greet them. Vrex and Janek followed, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "You're alive," Claire exclaimed, her scanner already in hand as she checked their injuries. "We were starting to think." "We don't go down that easily," Evelyn said with a tired smile, clasping her shoulder. "Is everyone okay?" "Mostly," Vrex rumbled. "No sign of more creatures since the explosion. Whatever you did, it worked." Janek's antennae twitched nervously. "The forest feels different. Less angry." Evelyn nodded. "The entity's gone. We cut off its power source and destroyed its core. The corruption should stop spreading now." Claire's brow furrowed. "Should? That doesn't sound reassuring." Evelyn hesitated. She couldn't ignore the possibility that remnants of the corruption might linger, hidden in the forest's depths. But for now, they had done all they could. The forest is alive. If it's as strong as it seems, it'll heal itself. We gave it a chance. The crew took a moment to rest and regroup. Vrex and Lornath worked on stabilizing what was left of their equipment, while Claire and Janek prepared a report on their findings. Evelyn sat apart from the others, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The victory felt hollow. They had survived, but they were still stranded on an alien world with no way to contact home. As if in answer to her thoughts, the ground beneath them pulsed gently. The bioluminescent plants brightened, their glow coalescing into a faint figure that stepped into view. Cleos had returned, his crystalline form shimmering with a renewed energy. He regarded the crew with an air of quiet approval. "You have proven yourselves worthy once more. The forest acknowledges your efforts." Evelyn stood, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "We've done everything you asked. The corruption is gone. Now, can you help us get home?" Cleos tilted his head, his voice resonating with a calm authority. "The forest will guide you to what you seek. Your survival and actions have earned its favor." The ground shimmered again, and a new path appeared, its glow leading deeper into the forest. Cleos extended an arm toward it. "Follow this path. At its end, you will find what you need to leave this world." Evelyn frowned, her skepticism creeping back. "What exactly will we find?" Cleos's form flickered briefly, as if he were fading. "That is for you to discover. The forest does not reveal all its secrets at once." Before Evelyn could press further, Cleos dissolved into a cascade of light, leaving the crew alone once more. The new path stretched ahead, beckoning them toward an uncertain future. Evelyn turned to her crew, their tired faces reflecting a mixture of hope and apprehension. "We've come this far," she said. "We can't stop now." The journey along the glowing path was quiet but filled with a sense of anticipation. The forest around them seemed to grow brighter with each step, its bioluminescent plants swaying gently as if guiding them forward. The oppressive energy that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a sense of peace that was almost disorienting after so much chaos. At last, the path opened into a vast clearing. In its center stood a towering structure, its surface shimmering with the same crystalline energy that had radiated from Cleos. The structure hummed softly, its presence both alien and familiar. The crew approached cautiously, their steps hesitant. Claire was the first to speak, her voice filled with awe. "It's the gateway, or some kind of transport." Vrex examined the structure, his hands running over its surface. "It's powered by the same energy that flowed through the forest. This could be our way off this planet." Janek looked skeptical. "And if it's not? What if it takes us somewhere worse?" Evelyn placed a hand on the structure, feeling its faint warmth beneath her fingers. "We don't have a choice. Staying here isn't an option." The structure responded to her touch, its surface glowing brighter. The hum grew louder, and a swirling vortex of light appeared at its center. The crew stepped back, shielding their eyes from the brilliance. Evelyn turned to her team, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. "This is it. Whatever's on the other side, we face it together." One by one, they stepped into the light, the vortex enveloping them in its warmth. Evelyn felt a surge of energy as the world around her dissolved into a cascade of colors. For a moment, there was nothing but light and motion. And then, the crew emerged into a new world, its sky a brilliant shade of violet, and its ground covered in shimmering crystal fields. In the distance, a towering structure loomed, its design unmistakably human. Evelyn's heart leaped. They had made it. As the crew stood in stunned silence, the realization of their survival and the hope of returning home washed over them. The journey had tested them in every way, but they had endured. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Evelyn knew they would face them together.